We are taught that life has rules. Cold kills. Radiation destroys. Time erases everything. When a heartbeat stops, we call it death. When a body goes still, we assume the story is over. When cells shut down, we believe life has failed. But biology doesn't always agree. At the smallest scales, life doesn't behave like a fragile flame that must burn continuously to exist. It behaves like a system, one designed to endure, to slow down, to shut itself off, to pause, repair, and resume when conditions allow. Across Earth, scientists have uncovered organisms that survive freezing solid, total dehydration, crushing radiation, the vacuum of space, and the passage of time itself. Not for days, not for years, not even for centuries, for tens of thousands of years. These organisms don't survive because they are stronger than death. They survive because they don't fight it. They wait. In this documentary, we explore real examples of life that refuses to die, not through resistance, but through patience. Because sometimes survival isn't about staying alive at all costs. Sometimes survival is about knowing when to stop and when to begin again. In the frozen ground of Siberian permafrost, scientists uncovered something that should not exist. Beneath layers of ancient ice that formed while humans were still painting caves, they found a microscopic nematode worm. It was frozen solid, locked in darkness, entombed for more than 40,000 years. The permafrost had remained stable. The temperature never rose above freezing. There was no liquid water, no oxygen, no energy source. By every biological definition we use, the environment was lifeless. And by every biological definition we teach, the worm was dead. Then researchers thawed the sample, and the worm moved. Not gradually, not weakly. It began crawling. It began feeding. It behaved as if the last 40,000 years had never happened. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't contamination. Genetic analysis confirmed the worm's age, a lineage that had been frozen since the late Pleistocene. What happened next forced scientists to confront something unsettling. This wasn't suspended animation in the cinematic sense. The worm wasn't quietly surviving in slow motion. Its metabolism had effectively stopped. Chemical reactions slowed to near zero. Cellular activity ceased. DNA, proteins, and internal structures were preserved in ice like a biological time capsule. Life didn't persist continuously. It paused. Many organisms can survive short interruptions. Humans can go minutes without oxygen. Some animals can enter torpor for hours. A few species can endure dormancy for weeks or months. But 40,000 years pushes survival beyond instinct, beyond adaptation, and into something else entirely. This worm didn't cling to life. It let go of it. Instead of resisting death, the worm entered a state where the difference between alive and dead became meaningless. No movement, no awareness, no internal activity, just preserved structure. And when conditions changed, when warmth returned and water flowed again, life resumed. Not restarted, resumed. This forces a deeply uncomfortable realization. If life can shut itself down this completely, then death may not always be a state. It may be a condition, a set of environmental parameters. Temperature, water, energy, chemistry, and conditions can change. For humans, death feels final because our biology collapses quickly. Our cells degrade. Our structures fail. Our information is lost. But this worm shows that if structure is preserved, if the blueprint remains intact, life does not need to be continuous to be real. It can wait. Which raises a question biology rarely asks directly. How much of what we call death is truly an ending? And how much of it is simply life waiting for permission to continue? The worm did not defeat death. It outlasted it. Worms are complex organisms. They have cells, tissues, systems that depend on balance, systems that can fail. Viruses are simpler. And that simplicity is exactly what makes them more frightening. In the frozen permafrost of Siberia, scientists uncovered viruses that had been locked in ice for more than 30,000 years. These were not traces, not genetic fragments, not broken remnants of something long dead. They were intact. When researchers thawed them, the viruses didn't struggle. They didn't weaken. They didn't fade. they were still infectious. The moment they encountered a suitable host, they resumed their purpose, hijacking cellular machinery, copying themselves, spreading. The virus didn't come back to life. It simply continued. Unlike worms or animals, viruses exist at the edge of what we call life. They don't eat. They don't breathe. They don't generate energy. They cannot reproduce on their own. Instead, they wait. A virus is little more than information, genetic instructions wrapped in protein. It has no metabolism to stop, no awareness to lose, no internal activity that needs to be sustained. Freezing didn't kill these viruses because nothing essential was running in the first place. Their structure alone was enough. Time passed. Ice accumulated. Civilizations rose and fell. And the virus remained, unchanged, intact, patient. This forces a deeply uncomfortable realization. If ancient viruses can remain viable after tens of thousands of years, then extinction is not guaranteed by time alone. It depends on whether structure is erased, not function. And ice is very good at preserving structure. Permafrost doesn't just freeze organisms. It archives them, which means the past is not necessarily gone. It may simply be inaccessible, waiting for the right conditions to return. As global temperatures rise and ancient permafrost begins to melt, these discoveries are no longer just scientific curiosities. They are warnings. Not because these specific viruses will necessarily spread, but because they demonstrate a principle we rarely confront. Some threats don't evolve. They don't adapt. They don't disappear. They persist. They don't survive by fighting the future. They survive by waiting for it. And if time alone cannot guarantee extinction, then the boundary between past and present is far thinner than we like to believe. The past is not always finished with us. Some things were never meant to disappear. They were only paused. If freezing can preserve life, radiation should destroy it. Radiation is chaos at the molecular level. It shreds DNA. It snaps chromosomes apart. It turns carefully ordered genetic instructions into noise. For most living organisms, enough radiation guarantees death. Cells lose the information they need to function. Replication fails. Repair systems collapse. There is no coming back from that, except for one organism, Deinococcus radiodurans. This bacterium can survive radiation levels thousands of times higher than what would kill a human instantly. Levels strong enough to sterilize medical equipment. Strong enough to turn most life into molecular debris. Its DNA doesn't survive intact. It gets destroyed. Radiation blasts its genome into fragments. And then something extraordinary happens. The microbe rebuilds itself, piece by piece. Like reassembling a book after every page has been ripped out, shredded, and thrown into the air. Then reconstructing the entire story without missing a sentence. Deinococcus doesn't prevent damage. It doesn't shield itself from radiation. It doesn't avoid catastrophe. It assumes catastrophe will happen. Its survival strategy isn't resistance. It's repair. Inside the cell, redundant genetic copies overlap like backups of the same file stored in multiple locations. Specialized enzymes scan the fragments, align them, and stitch the genome back together with astonishing accuracy. What would be fatal chaos to any other organism is treated as routine maintenance. Damage isn't failure. It's expected. This forces a fundamental shift in how we think about resilience. We tend to imagine survival as toughness, as the ability to withstand harm without breaking. But Deinococcus survives by breaking completely and then fixing itself faster than collapse can take hold. Life doesn't need to avoid disaster. It only needs to recover faster than damage accumulates. For Deinococcus radiodurans, genetic destruction is not an endpoint. It's a temporary inconvenience, which leads to a disturbing conclusion. Death isn't always caused by harm alone. It's caused by the inability to repair that harm. When damage outpaces recovery, life ends. When repair keeps up, life continues, no matter how extreme the conditions. This reframes what radiation, catastrophe, and destruction really mean. They are not absolute killers. They are stress tests. And life, at least in some forms, has learned how to pass them. Deinococcus doesn't survive because the universe is gentle. It survives because it is prepared for the universe to be violent. And in doing so, it exposes a truth that biology rarely states outright. Life doesn't require safety. It requires the ability to rebuild itself after everything has gone wrong. There is an animal so small it can sit on the tip of a pin, and it can survive space. Tardigrades, often called water bears, are microscopic animals found almost everywhere on Earth. In moss, in soil, in deep oceans, in mountain ice. They look harmless, almost cartoonish, but they are among the most resilient forms of life ever discovered. Tardigrades can endure radiation, boiling heat, crushing pressure, freezing cold, extreme dehydration, and the vacuum of outer space, conditions that should destroy cells. When the environment becomes lethal, the tardigrade does something extraordinary. It shuts itself down. The body contracts. Water leaves its cells. Metabolism drops to nearly zero. Chemical reactions stop. The animal enters a state known as a ton, dry, inert, and motionless. By most definitions, it looks dead. There is no movement, no energy production, no biological activity. Time passes. Years later, sometimes decades, water returns. And the tardigrade wakes up. No damage, no confusion, no memory of the pause, no sign that time ever passed at all. It resumes feeding, moving, reproducing, as if nothing happened. Tardigrades don't survive extreme conditions by fighting them. They don't resist heat. They don't block radiation. They don't shield themselves from vacuum. They remove themselves from the process entirely. By shutting down almost completely, they step outside of time. In space exposure experiments, tardigrades were launched beyond Earth's atmosphere and exposed directly to cosmic radiation and vacuum, conditions that rip molecules apart. Some survived, some reproduced afterward. This is not endurance in the way humans understand it. It isn't toughness. It isn't strength. It's patience encoded into biology. The tardigrade doesn't try to live through catastrophe. It waits until catastrophe is over. And that forces a question we rarely ask. If life can survive space, if it can pause itself through vacuum, radiation, and time, then what does uninhabitable really mean? Is it a property of the environment or a limitation of our imagination? For humans, survival requires constant activity, breathing, circulation, metabolism. For tardigrades, survival sometimes requires the opposite, stopping, which reveals something deeply unsettling. Life doesn't need Earth to be gentle. It doesn't even need Earth to be present. As long as structure can be preserved, as long as information remains intact, life can wait for the universe to cooperate again. The tardigrade doesn't conquer space. It ignores it. And in doing so, it exposes the narrowness of our assumptions about where life can exist and how long it can endure without existing at all. When you put all of this together, worms reviving after 40,000 years, viruses older than civilization, microbes rebuilding shattered DNA, animals surviving space, a pattern begins to emerge. Life doesn't always fight death. It waits it out. At the microscopic scale, death is often not destruction. It's unfavorable conditions: cold, dryness, radiation, absence. When energy disappears, life pauses. When water vanishes, life stores itself. When chemistry breaks down, life waits for repair. And when conditions improve, life resumes. This reframes one of our deepest assumptions. We tend to treat death as a moment, a clean boundary between before and after, a line that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Biology treats death very differently. Biology treats it as a variable. As long as structure remains intact, DNA preserved, membrane stable. Life does not require continuity to remain real. It does not need constant activity. It does not need awareness. It only needs the possibility of repair. The difference between alive and dead is not always a switch. It's a gradient, a range shaped by temperature, by chemistry, by time. For humans, this distinction feels unsettling because our biology collapses quickly. Our cells degrade. Our structures fail. Our information is lost. For other forms of life, collapse is slower or avoidable altogether, which means the boundary between alive and dead is not universal. It is conditional. Life does not ask whether it should continue. It only responds to whether it can. As long as the blueprint remains readable, life does not consider itself finished. This forces a final, uncomfortable realization. Death is not always an ending. Sometimes it is a pause imposed by the environment, which means some forms of life are not designed to survive continuously. They are designed to survive discontinuously, to stop, to store themselves, to wait. Life does not always resist death. Sometimes it simply refuses to acknowledge it as final. So what does dead really mean? We define life by movement, by breath, by heat, by visible activity. When a body goes still, we call it death. When cells shut down, we assume the story is over. But biology tells a different story. At the smallest scales, life doesn't need to move to exist. It doesn't need to breathe. It only needs to remain possible. Life can slow itself down, shut itself off, store its information, and wait for the universe to cooperate again. Sometimes for years, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for tens of thousands of years. Death isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's a pause long enough for us to forget something was still waiting. And the most unsettling truth isn't that life refuses to die. It's that it doesn't need us to notice. We define life by movement, by breath, by heat, by visible activity. When a body goes still, we call it death. When cells shut down, we assume the story is over. But biology tells a different story. At the smallest scales, life doesn't need to move to exist. It doesn't need to breathe. It doesn't need to be warm. It only needs to remain possible. Life can slow itself down, shut itself off, store its information, and wait for the universe to cooperate again. Sometimes for years, sometimes for centuries, sometimes for tens of thousands of years. Death isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's a pause long enough for us to forget something was still waiting. And the most unsettling truth isn't that life refuses to die. It's that it doesn't need us to notice.